Karl Hand, welcome back to Spiritual Misfits, my friend.
I'm so glad to be back.
How long has it been since the last time? It's got to be over a year.
It's hard to guess. Yeah, it's because I know I've been on a few times, but yeah, it's always fun. It's people. I know a lot of people who love the podcast, and I'm always proud to say, hey, if you look back, you'll find me in a couple of episodes. So.
I think I've referenced you a few times recently. Actually, there's been a few episodes where I've said, "Hey, people should go and check out that Karl episode where he was talking about." I always remember the armor of God that you kind of
Yeah,
brought to life in a different way. So if people haven't checked out your episodes, we've talked queer theology, queer Bible commentary stuff. Karl is the pastor of Crave Church. Do you want to introduce yourself again for people that haven't met you? Give us just the quick reintroduction to the wonderful Karl Hand.
I don't know how to do it quickly, but I do. I'm a pastor in Metropolitan Community Church, which it's an affirming church. It's also a church that emerged from the queer community itself, and I'm very purposely saying the queer community instead of delving into the gay church and all those different labels that are put on it. I work with Australian Student Christian Movement, which is really about students and empowering people to learn how to put their faith into action. And yeah, I have a bit of a background in theology, biblical studies, and I love all that kind of stuff. And so it's queer theory is something that has interested me for a long time as well. And I've been a huge fan of the Reformation Project, and I was a huge fan of Matthew Vines when he first emerged, probably like 15 or more years ago, as an affirming theologian. And so it's been interesting watching stuff come up about how his work has kind of T-boned with queer theology.
Mm.
It's a bit strange to me. It's a bit like watching a train wreck in slow motion or something at the moment. But yeah.
So this is part of the reason that we're talking. We're in a moment in time where there's been a bit of a flash online of different. Well, the first thing that I engaged with was there was a podcast. There's a podcast that some people may have heard of called Uncommon Ground, hosted by a guy named Justin Brierley. And he had David Bennett and Matthew Vines on for a conversation around their different approaches to their faith and sexuality, essentially. And in that conversation, Matthew Vines, who has been, I guess, a big name in terms of advocating for churches to embrace same-sex marriage and affirming and inclusive theology, he made comments distancing himself from queer theology in particular. And then shortly after that came out, there was a piece that he published in the New York Times called "I'm Gay, Not Queer. It Matters." Now, we're going to get into the substance of what Matthew said and have a conversation around some of the different questions it raises, the different challenges it raises. At the beginning, we did both want to just make sure that we say that this is going to be a conversation that we're kind of muddling our way through imperfectly, and this is sensitive territory, and it is connected to people's trauma. Karl, you are a pastor and a pastoral thinker, so I wonder if there's anything you want to say at the beginning, just in terms of how we might just gently and graciously enter the complexity here.
Yeah, there's so much that I want to say, and I've been kind of wondering how to put it into a nutshell at the moment. But I've been really aware, like when I was reading the New York Times piece, even before I saw any reactions to it, I just felt it touching on so many issues of religious trauma. And one of the really prominent reactions to it has been, this guy's just another church leader telling us, who is okay and who is not okay. And I think like in the conversation that we're about to have, there's a danger in whatever like expertise or whatever platform or whatever status we're bringing into this conversation. Part of the issue has been churches trying to tell people what they should think and what they should do and what they should feel. And there's a power dynamic in that. I just want to position myself as, I don't want to tell anybody what they should think or feel or do. I don't understand my calling, and I don't understand ministry in the Christian faith as being about being the moral police. And I don't think it's about, we know God better than you do, and we should tell you who God is. And so I can maybe point to a little bit of experience. You know, I might know some stuff because I've studied some areas, but that doesn't mean that I'm an expert on God, because nobody is. And it doesn't mean I'm an expert on anyone's experience. And so I don't need to put what I'm saying onto anyone. I'm just trying to struggle my way through this and hoping to collaborate, and to share what I think could be helpful about understanding it better.
Mm, that's good. Yeah, so obviously some of this conversation might connect with people's, deep and personal lived experiences. And you who is listening, you beautiful humans that tune into this, that have pressed play, I want to encourage you, have the wisdom and discernment to enter if this is a conversation that's going to be helpful for you. Also, feel entirely free if it's not going to be helpful for you to just skip this one. That's fine too. One of the reasons I messaged you, Carl, was I guess after I saw these, listened to and then saw, various little videos coming out, people reacting to what Matthew Vines had said. You got like anything online, right? You got a whole mix of people responding and reacting in different ways, and plenty of people kind of immediately jumping to condemning Matthew Vines, and perhaps understandably so. But I appreciated that what you posted pushed back against what he was saying, but fundamentally tried to position that within saying Matthew's work has been really helpful over time to me and many others, and I want to constantly humanize anyone involved in a conversation like this. And so I thought we could just start. This is not what you do in hot take land, or we're making a 60-second reel here. But just for people that may not be familiar, do you want to take us back to maybe what Matthew's earlier work has kind of paved the way for?
Yeah.
And yeah, what his book, God and the Gay Christian, may have meant to yourself and to others.
I was in a Bible study just before I came for this interview, and I mentioned that this was happening. And I said, I wonder if many people really see the value in that kind of deep interpretation of certain Bible verses that are used against people. And I just had a list of people in my group saying, "Oh, that saved my faith." Like that, I didn't have a way forward until I came across this stuff. And so I came out, and I was growing up in a very conservative religious environment. And I was a church kid in the 80s and the 90s, and it was, there was a lot of kind of American influence fundamentalism around there and very literal readings of the Bible. And I came out in 2000, and I had to use university libraries to find books about affirming theology. Like I had to order interlibrary loans. It was lucky that I had a university library card.
Mm.
And if you went to a local Christian bookshop, you would find 20 books on homosexuality, all saying that it's a sin. And there were books of affirming theology in the footnotes and in the indexes that they were debunking. But you couldn't find those books in those stores. You could only read one side of it. And once you got the books, they may have talked about the ancient context, but they would include the full text of 20 different ancient historical sources. They would use technical jargon. They would talk about their methodology. They would talk about historical critical method. They would talk about semantic range. That it was just so deep and so confusing. And meanwhile, at the Christian bookshop, you can find a pamphlet that just says, it's a cartoon and it's got 5 reasons why you can't be gay in it. And it's so easy to access. And I think it was like around 2007 or 8, around some of that time and I had digested all of that stuff and I'd processed it. And all of a sudden, Matthew Vines made a YouTube, and he just summarized it in a way that was simple and easy to understand. And the moment I saw that YouTube, I never gave anyone any different reading material. I just said, look, you can watch it on a YouTube. You can watch it in 1 hour, and it doesn't use scholarly jargon. And the other half of that is that it was reasonable. A lot of the texts that were a little bit more accessible at that time would often try and, give you these kind of scandalous suggestions that, oh my goodness, Ruth and Naomi were lesbian lovers, and King David had this gay affair with Prince Jonathan. And I'm not commenting on those reconstructions. Like, there are different views on those. But when you're in a place of searching for answers and you have to imagine that King David is gay, it's so confusing and unconvincing. And Matthew just didn't get into any of that. He was like, he didn't say anything that wasn't based on evidence and that you couldn't check and that wouldn't make sense when you're trying to explain it to your pastor and to your conservative Christian friends. And there was so much about it that was brilliant and accessible at the same time. And I think that it had a huge impact on people who were doing that struggle, who were in a place of not understanding. I want to accept myself, but I can't fathom how this fits into my faith and my understanding of the world and my understanding of scripture. Yeah, that was what I think Matthew Vines was. And then that video grew into a book, and it grew into a website with resources. It grew into a conference. It grew into like multiple different channels of that research. You can now click through and find helpful stuff about trans issues, about bisexual visibility, all different related topics. It has been incredibly helpful. And that was one of the reasons why when I read New York Times, that I just felt like the pit of my stomach just like turning into concrete, because I think I could recognize what Matthew was trying to do and why he was trying to do it. But at the same time, in my head, I could already hear the responses and the questions that people were going to have.
Mm.
And I don't think that the impact was the intention. I think that those two things have been completely different to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's huge. Yeah, I remember watching that YouTube video, and it's interesting because this is just a sidebar, but I think what kind of got me over the line in terms of my journey from having non-affirming theology to affirming theology was a different kind of interpretive approach to Matthew. But I always have just had this sense that, man, if that's helping
Yeah.
more people to get there,
Yeah.
and arguably there would be few people that have helped as many churches and as many people to go on that journey. That's huge, and we shouldn't kind of understate that. So in a nutshell, obviously a lot of the heat around this discussion is he's trying to separate, I guess, gay rights and queer liberation. Just in shorthand, these are kind of two terms that he's saying, okay, gay rights, same-sex marriage, yes, I'm for that. Queer liberation, queer theory, queer theology, no, maybe not so much. He's a fan of the former, less so the latter. Before we kind of examine that argument in itself, I wonder if you want to do a quick job of trying to maybe give us like a generous reading of his argument. Why would he be trying to do that? What is the underlying tension that as far as you can tell, has maybe led him to putting that piece in the New York Times, or coming out and saying something like that? What's the Steelman version of that?
Still, I don't know. I think maybe a softer man version is what we need.
Sure.
When I saw him with David Bennett, I don't know, there was a lot of Steelman energy in that room.
Right.
And I think that maybe a level of defensiveness is what made that argument very probably defensive in some ways. But I think that behind what Matthew is trying to say is a concern that affirming theology will just eat through everything that is valuable. He actually, I think it was in the David Bennett discussion where he used the word universal acid. He's like, queer theory is a universal. And the reason that he said that, like, I don't think he was trying to sound like some kind of, I don't know, Disney supervillain like thing. I think that he was just saying that in his view, the way that queerness is stated is opposition to every kind of moral principle. And he quoted a number of different sources on that. And I think that's where the problem came out, because those sources were chosen selectively. Well, no, that sounds like it's on purpose. They were examples that were shocking. Sometimes they were meant to be satirical. Sometimes they were meant to be provocative, but weren't really what queer theory is about. But also, he was conflating all the different meanings of queer, in that he was talking about adopting a queer identity. And then he gave examples from Queer Nation, which was a direct action group in the 90s that did shocking stuff in public. And then he talked about queer theory and used definitions from queer theory. A queer identity and a queer activism and queer theory are three completely different things. And you can't use a definition from one of them to define the other one. And swapping between those was causing a problem. I think in his interpretation, he had seen a number of people saying that we should just have a kind of an anything goes approach to life. And he was saying, well, that's not what affirming theology is trying to say. We actually want to hold on to what is good about the Christian tradition. We don't want to destroy all of it. And also, can gay people just be boring and normal? Like, I think there's a lot of anxiety around that for a lot of people who come out. There are people who love to be kind of over the top and extravagant, but the way that queer is sometimes defined makes it sound like the queerest person is the most, advanced person. So everyone has to be as weird as you possibly can be. And I don't know, sometimes it's just nice on a Friday night to like fall asleep watching the TV and eating pizza. Like, can you, like, just that, like, don't we have a right to be boring? And I feel like that may have been something of what's behind what he was saying.
Mm.
And when you understand queer theory, absolutely everyone has a right to be boring, and nobody has to call themselves queer. Like, queer theory doesn't care what identity label you use. Like, queer theory finds labels to be part of human life, but it's something that queer theory tries to resist. I remember when I came out in 2000, a lot of gay websites, because you had to, everyone had to log on, and you would find websites like Bridges Across the Divide and places where, Matthew was first saw the side A and side B stuff. And you'd have to write in your sexual orientation when you were making your profile. And it would, like, sometimes it would just give you gay or bi or straight as the option. And then sometimes it would give you an option of label free. And I used to love being able to choose label free.
Mm.
And back then, it was like, even just like shifting from bisexual to gay was kind of controversial. Like, some people thought that bisexuals were, I don't know, they were plants from the heterosexual world, or they were, like, there was a lot of suspicion about that. And for young people to just be able to say, I think I'm queer, when I saw that became a label that people could use for themselves, and it meant they weren't locked in, I think that's just a kinder way of allowing people to understand themselves.
Mm.
And that's, queer theory is about questioning the labels, like making them a little bit looser, putting a little bit more wiggle room into them, not judging everyone by whether or not they're the perfect example of what a young man should be, which the picture in our mind is, a certain kind of person. And it struggles with labels. It does, like what Matthew was saying, is that it's opposed to all norms. But in queer theory, norm usually means like a picture of what a person is supposed to be. It doesn't mean a moral value. Like, when you say queer theory is questioning towards norms, queer theory, most queer theorists would uphold all kinds of norms. I think, like, democracy, I think equality, I think respect and dignity. There would be so many values that are important. It's not just all of them are wrong. when it says we're opposed to every norm, queer theory critiques the way that norms are policed and enforced by power on people. But once we've done that, we can still have a norm. We'll probably need to critique it again, but it's about a constant negotiation with the norms that exist. That it's. I think I've just wandered off from whatever question we were up to.
No, this is great.
I
I'm
don't
with you,
even know
Carl. I
where
mean, there's lots of thoughts. There's lots of thoughts
Yeah.
here. In one sense, I'm thinking, it makes me think about obviously a lot of conversations on Spiritual Misfits podcast are kind of tracing the journey that people go through when they have a construct that then kind of comes undone, and then they kind of walk through the wilderness for a while. They use words like deconstruction, then they find stability again, but it's a cycle. And the goal is not to find that stability again and then lock it in forever. It's to be someone who can move through. And I wonder if there's some sort of parallel there with, we question the norms, find stability again, but then always let's keep alive that spirit of being able to critique and question and look from the edge, because the edge is constantly moving, and that's just part of the cycle. The other thing I was thinking there, though, is that there's obviously this, I think in some sense, the word queer, and this is what I feel, and maybe other people do too, it can be helpful because it can carry a lot. There's a lot of different things that we can use that word. Like you said, there's a bit of uncertainty there. But then I think that maybe the flip side of that, which is what you were getting at, is that for one word to carry so much, when we've got queer as a verb and queer as a noun, and we've got queer as a theory and queer as an identity, no wonder we find ourselves, kind of getting into some clashing expectations around what this word is holding for people. So it's kind of a gift when a word can be flexible and malleable, but then it's also kind of setting us up for these moments where, whoa, it's easy to misunderstand each other. If you're saying this word and you mean this thing, and I'm saying this word and I mean that thing. From what I could tell, like reading through the New York Times piece, I could kind of identify two main objections that I think Matthew has to the word queer. And I wanted to chat with you about these. And we're kind of starting to get into it, but, just kind of taking them one at a time and just unpacking whether or not these are genuine objections. So from what I could tell, Matthew thinks the word queer is too elastic. Kind of what I was just saying, that basically anyone can identify as queer. And the contrast would be that being born attracted to people of the same sex is something you don't choose. Being gay is kind of just a birth, it's biological kind of birth thing. Whereas he's saying that queer is something that perhaps people construct an identity around, or they move into. It's just a bit more fluid. So too elastic would be his first objection. Second objection would be it's too adversarial, which is what we were just saying, that there's kind of this spirit of queerness, if we will use such language, that is kind of pushing in an adversarial, kind of, it's posturing itself for battle against what is considered normal and perhaps kind of comfortable. And in many ways, he's saying, like you're saying, he just is kind of partly saying, I just want to be married like a normal person and to just get on with life and not be having to engage with this constant battle. So let's just discuss these one at a time. First, what are your thoughts on the argument that gay identity isn't chosen but queer might be? Is this true, and does it matter?
Oh man, both of those. Is it true? It doesn't matter. They're both complex things to respond to. The way that queer is used in queer theory doesn't refer to anything about what a person is. Like, it's not your essence, it's not a quality that you possess. Queerness in queer theory is your relationship to what is normal. So it's a position that you find yourself in. And if I visit a different culture, people will read my gender differently, and I might seem more queer there. I might seem less queer there.
Mm-hmm.
And in queer theory, absolutely. The original texts of queer theory were actually written for the purpose of opposing identity politics. like the Judith Butler's Gender Trouble is sometimes seen as the first thing that was written. I think it was 1980, and she was talking about feminism and the way that feminism was only applied to some kinds of women, and that there were debates within feminism about, what is a real woman and how can we support the needs of that person. And Judith Butler was calling for us to think about all the different people that are impacted by patriarchy, or what she called heteronormativity, and all the different ways it impacts us. And she was really calling for a broad coalition. I think that patriarchy and sexism affects women. It also affects children. It also affects the elderly. It also affects the disabled. Like, there are so many different parts of this. So queerness was just the relationship that you had to a kind of oppression. And that, when she said heteronormativity, she was talking about feminism, not gay rights as such. But gay people quickly realized, okay, well, gay people and transgender people and bisexual people, and all of us are being impacted by heteronormativity. So a queer politics is a broad coalition where we respond together. And obviously that's a different thing than young people coming out as queer now instead of gay, with that kind of more elasticity. That broad coalition should bring together the LGBT and all different kinds of folks who can engage in a queer politic together, engage in a kind of activism together. The word gay refers to something real, like you have a sexual orientation. It's gay. Like, that's something that, we've only discovered and understood recently. But okay, humans seem to have a fixed sexual orientation. It can shift a little bit, but it maybe probably won't even shift the way you want it to, and you can't change it with therapy, and it's not based on, we have an orientation. It's just something that you can observe about people, and that's being gay. And being bisexual is a different thing. And those are identities that we can adopt. But there's no reason why you can't have a gay identity and be a part of the queer activist movement by joining that broad coalition that someone like Judith Butler was calling for. It's a completely different question. And then when queer, like, the identity label of queer is sometimes called, it's an umbrella term. The queer community comes together. Yeah, I mean, that's something where I think, Matthew can absolutely say it's not very useful for me to identify as queer. Like, I go to all these conservative churches and I talk to conservative, boards with nice elderly people who are trying to figure out how to make the church more welcoming for gay people. And if they meet someone like Matthew, who's like a nicely married young man with a husband, and that just works well in his context. So just let it. I think queer theory doesn't have a problem with that. It doesn't have a problem with someone being gay. It's queer theory is like, we're kind of looking at the big picture of how we confront heteronormativity in society at large. Call yourself whatever you want. Like, we just want to find a way to get all of these people moving together in the same direction against, certain forms of oppression that affect all of us in different ways.
So this second kind of, problem that he might have with it, I guess, is around the
Yeah.
maybe like an enduring state of opposition, or because there's a part of what you just said that you can almost think, is the end goal to almost do away with the need for these, because we get to a point where you can be, kind of whoever you want to be, and we don't need to have a norm to challenge. You kind of think, is there an ideal end goal where it's just, we don't have to have a marginalized people group pushing against the norm? But I guess his point is that the very nature of what he is perceiving as queer liberation is to set itself up in opposition permanently. maybe I'm not kind of articulating it very well, but yeah, what's kind of your response to this, potentially this kind of objection?
This is where I think swapping between definitions got him into a problem. In like his argument actually doesn't work the way that he wants it to. Because in a sense, I think that he's talking about a certain kind of political strategy. And in particular, there were groups called ACT UP and Queer Nation in the 1990s who they kind of adopted queer as an identity politic in that they were queer people. And one of the slogans of Queer Nation was, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," which kind of implies, this is a thing that we are. And again, like queer theorists reflect on those forms of activism because those were very powerful, very influential movements, and they achieved a lot of really great things, particularly drawing attention to the HIV/AIDS crisis. But queer theorists typically said adopting queer as an umbrella is not super queer in the way that we're talking about queer as being a questioning of identity politics. You're doing an identity politics now with queer. And those groups really kind of enjoyed the shock value. So ACT UP did die-ins where a whole bunch of people would be in a common place and they would just all die on the spot. And like the public would see this happen and they'd be horrified by it. And then, it would be communicated, this is people dying of AIDS, we're ignoring it. Like they wanted to shock you because they wanted to draw attention to something.
Mm.
Queer Nation, they love to, actually, they weren't just reclaiming the word queer, words like faggot and dyke and tranny and all that kind of stuff. They in the 90s, sometimes you may have seen just t-shirts, like a white t-shirt with the word faggot on the front. And, some people feel super proud wearing a faggot t-shirt. They're going out for the night. I'm a faggot. I don't care what anyone thinks. That was the politics of Queer Nation. It was very in your face. It was very, I think Mardi Gras had some scandalous floats sometimes that were also associated with that style of politics. So I think Matthew saw that political intervention and some comments on it, and then maybe characterized the queer identity as being about that, or saying that queer theory says we have to do that. Neither of those are true. That shocking political action was a direct action movement that happened at a certain time in history, and it happened in response to queer bashings and everyone ignoring AIDS and letting millions of people die and doing nothing about it, and it shocked people and it got some attention. And I don't, queer theory doesn't say everyone has to do this. And in fact, one of the really interesting things was that Matthew quoted, I think in the New York Times, he quoted a definition by Daniel Halperin of queerness as being constantly pushing against norms. And the weirdest thing is that in context, the argument that Daniel Halperin is making is about Queer Nation. And he's saying at that point, this adopting of, a particular identity and then expressing it very loudly is, it's a different kind of norm that we're creating. But in fact, queer theory pushes against every norm. That's the argument that it's actually the opposite of what Matthew Vines read. Because that kind of activism, effective as it is, it doesn't queer things. It like to say that we're a kind of people, we are queer people, and we're always going to be here and we're not going anywhere, doesn't loosen the categories that we use for people. It doesn't, it creates a new identity politics and sometimes creates the kind of rivalries that we see between gay and queer, which is the opposite of the broad unity that queer theory is actually calling for between different oppressed groups of people.
Mm.
So I think that's a total. I don't want to say this because Matthew's a really great researcher, and a lot of queer theorists and queer activists throw this material out in a way that they want to be shocking. It's not difficult to be confused by what that means.
Mm.
but that's not what it means. Like pushing
Sure.
back against norms is not constantly shocking people and saying that there are no moral values anywhere. That's not what that means.
This almost sounds like a proof texting situation where
It's so ironic, yeah.
and
And I
yeah.
when I was looking up that passage in Daniel, in Saint Foucault is actually the book that it's in. I'm looking it up. I'm looking at the context, and I'm like, "Am I doing exegesis again? Like, is this the book of Romans? No, this is queer theory. What?"
I think one of the realities is just that any group of people, any movement, any political movement, we do fall into. It's the same thing that happens with the Bible, where we can be united in one sense and yet interpreting certain texts or
Yeah,
ideas in very different ways. And the
yeah,
challenge, I think, is to come back to in all of this. Well, for me, the motivation, the impulse is how do we create more just, inclusive, and obviously, as someone trying to follow Jesus, a world that
yeah,
models the ethic of, what he called the kingdom of God. And that the tricky thing is we don't always agree on the strategy for how to get there.
yeah,
Sometimes it's public shock value. Other times it might be, a more gentle and relational approach. Often it's probably some messy forwards, backwards combination of both. And I think probably what is for a lot of people probably heartbreaking about just the headline I'm gay, not queer kind of, sort of posture is that it's basically we were all on the same team or we thought we were, and you're trying to divide it. To me, it's almost like a denominational split where it's kind of like, well, I know that there are differences here, but can we hold together for the sake of the end goal of trying to create a room where, a future where more people can flourish and thrive?
yeah. I I don't like. I can't think about times in history where really powerful change hasn't happened without different coalitions with very different ideologies coming together to oppose it.
Mm.
It doesn't tend to be that there's one particular interest group or one identity group that just pushes and then all of a sudden it throws over. But I think the forms of oppression that exist in this world are bad for everyone. Like I think that heteronormativity is bad for straight people. Like I think straight people should be calling themselves queer and opposing heteronormativity. And I don't mean calling themselves gay. I mean maybe pointing out the fact that you happen to be in a home where it's a straight couple, but the woman prefers to do yard work. That's not the norm. That's not what we're told things are supposed to be like. And I think Daniel Halperin gives the example of heterosexual couples who don't have children. Like what that's not the heteropatriarchal normative model. We're given a script of what it's supposed to be like. And if you don't end up having children, I think that you are queer in relationship to the norm. Doesn't mean you have to use that label. It doesn't mean you have to like that word. But queerness is what this position is about. It's a tension between you and the way that society expects you to be. And there is a constant pushback against that norm because there are always people who don't quite fit in. And what we're trying to do is renegotiate those norms so they're a bit better, a bit more flexible, a bit kinder, a bit closer to reality. Yeah, that's
Look, everything you just said was just a real affirmation to me that the title Spiritual Misfits
yeah,
is kind of doing that work. Genuinely, I think about it because the point to me, like, is I don't want anyone to feel like a misfit because there's something fundamentally wrong with them. I want people to identify with the playful nature of there are systems that are always going to be out of alignment with what is good for us, and to feel like a bit of a misfit with them is probably a good thing. To just not accept the status quo, but to find and again, then it's kind of the tension on the other side is, but you don't always have to be in battle mode. It's this kind of it's more of a to and fro and kind of moving between. Yeah, I think the other thing that comes up, and if you're listening to this conversation about Matthew Vines and you're not in church world, if you're not within kind of a faith tradition, you're probably just like, this is just what is going on here. it probably sounds extra weird from the outside. But I think that the layer that maybe is beneath the surface in part of what Matthew's saying is, I think that a big part of his argument is, I still have a fairly traditional sexual ethic. I have a Christian sexual ethic. I just think that the boundaries need to be moved a little bit. And he's got, very, as you said, sort of very well researched reasons for that in terms of his engagement with Scripture. As we've talked about, there's kind of a few different ways that the word queer can be used. One way is how somebody might dress, how they might identify, kind of more of a subculture kind of idea. But then obviously the other way that people think of it is, this is about sexual ethics. And I think some people might think, okay, if we allow for, or we celebrate queerness more broadly, are we having our sexual ethic just completely loosened to the point where it is in no recognizable way Christian? I think there is a bit of a void here, where there hasn't been a great deal of, I think, progressive theology that has done a good job of articulating a positive sexual ethic that goes beyond just consent, perhaps, which is kind of what is the default sexual ethic more broadly in our culture. So what do you think about this? Because I think this is the underlying anxiety for a lot of people. If we embrace queer theology, queer, kind of as a mode, what does this mean for Christian sexual ethics?
There is some good stuff out there on a progressive Christian sexual ethics. It's maybe this is like the situation before Matthew's video, where I could tell you what libraries to order it from, but it's
Sure.
it's harder to access. There are absolutely queer ways of expressing sexual ethics, and much like with the question of identity, queer theorists don't care what identity label you use. They're looking for a way of bringing folks of different identities together. Have any sexual ethic, in terms of what queer theory is trying to achieve, we don't mind. We want people with all kinds of sexual ethics to be working together. And so when I talked about the early 80s and the identity politics in feminism, one of the big arguments that was happening in feminism was whether feminism should support the rights of sex workers. And that's where one of the foundational texts of queer theory was written by Gail Rubin. And it was called Thinking About Sex, something like Thinking About Sex. And she had in it a diagram, and I sent you a copy of this. I don't know if you can share it with the listeners, but there's like a safety zone, a charmed circle in the center. And she talks about the way that traditionally, since Augustine, the West has viewed sex as dangerous, but there are certain things that we can do to make it safe, like getting married and, like fasting from it on certain days. And we can somehow take the danger out of it. And she notes that a lot of the sexual principles that we use as society are on this spectrum. And if each of the spectrums is like a spoke on a wheel, things like monogamy are in the middle. And then things like casual or open relationships are on the outside. And we have these arguments about where exactly this should go. Like, does monogamy mean, you shouldn't even be alone in a room with another woman? Like, you should use the Billy Graham rule. Or there are all of these steps along the way. And then we find a cutoff point. And then another one might be something like good sex is childbearing, or good sex is in couples. And on the outside of that is something like masturbation and polyamory, because that's either alone or it's with more than a couple. The middle stuff is always safe. And what she says with that is, a lot of people read that and they think, oh, you're saying we should do all the stuff on the outside. She's saying this model is oppressive. We shouldn't be thinking of it this way at all. And she actually compares this sexual ethics to the logic of the racism ideology that had been openly promoted just a few decades before then, and maybe a little bit is coming back now, where when something is pure enough to fit a particular model, that's good and safe, and deviations from that norm become dangerous and chaotic. And if we let them closer to us, then they're going to make our safety, called into question. She says what we need to find is a more democratic sexual ethic, where instead of policing the boundaries, we're talking about the quality of our relationships. We're talking about how we treat one another. We're talking about how pleasure is negotiated, whether that pleasure is mutual, whether coercion is being used in that interaction. And that's a really interesting thing, the coercion thing, that consent and coercion are the two parts of that binary. And we often say, is just consent going to be sufficient? That's the easy thing that everyone does. I haven't believed that since Hollywood Access tapes. And the Epstein files, I think, have just put a nail in the coffin that somehow consent is this universally upheld value. And people don't care. They'll elect a president who brags about sexually assaulting people. Consent, if we were to get even close to consent, that would transform our sexual ethics if we were to value that one thing alone.
Mm.
So if queer theory does hold up consent as being a value, we shouldn't be thinking of that as something minimal or less than the traditional Christian sexual ethic. The Christian religion as a whole has not really started modeling that. And in terms of its global politic, doesn't even seem to value it at all currently.
Mm.
So, yeah, there are so many different sexual ethics that even Gail Rubin talks about in what was seen as being quite a scandalous claim that these aberrant behaviors, should perhaps be taken seriously. But what she's saying is, let's find a more democratic ethic where we're not valuing sexual ethics based on protecting some kind of purity model that looks like certain perfect people in their certain perfect families. Let's look at the quality of relationships. Let's look at the values that underlie our sexual ethics. And I just think that's a more challenging ethic to embrace.
Mm.
Like just following a list of rules, it might take self-control, but it doesn't really require you to go deep into transforming who you are. But I think as men have been learning the concept of consent, I hope, since the Me Too movement, and as norms have been changed there, I think a lot of people have had to look really deeply at the way that they interact with people and say, do you know what? I don't think I ever was a total jerk, but maybe sometimes I've been more entitled than I should have been. And that's called them to actually question the way that they are in the world and the way that they value other people. And whether, you're with someone intimately, whether you're treating that person as a person in that situation, or whether you're thinking about this as a transaction, or whether you're thinking about this as some kind of conquest, like those. Yeah, that calls on like a constant attempt to become a better person, I think. And like hopefully our sexual relationships are places where we also grow morally, that we find out how we can interact with other people, and we reflect on it, and that's a force for good. So queer theory is all about sexual ethics. Absolutely it is. And that, I think, is to me the most frustrating mistake that Matthew has, maybe seen some things that are put in the vein of queer nation. We're faggots, get used to it, and we're going to do whatever we want, which was a form of activism, but not realizing that that is not what queer theory as a whole was doing. And also queer theory itself is a place where a lot of really fruitful ethical reflection can take place. It won't provide you with a list of rules, but that's not what that discipline is there for.
You could say though that I think if I'm to join in the invitation here, then I would say that in a world where, regardless of whether or not people are married or in certain kind of correct boxes, obviously it it's our world is rife with consent, with sex that is abusive, that is
Mm.
controlling, that
Yeah,
is self-centered, that is egotistical, that is harmful in all kinds of ways. You could say that it is queer to develop, sacrificial, other oriented, deeply respectful, mutually enjoyable, sexuality. Like that would be the queer thing in some ways, right?
I think so.
And
Yeah,
I sort of think part of this reminds me of, back in youth group days. Like it was always the question of like, where's the line? What can you do? What act is allowed? And it's sort of like that's still the question that is kind of there in a lot of people's mind, which is it's very different to asking. And I imagine that the kind of Jesus conversation around sexual ethics, if Jesus was in the room, would be to go, yeah, you're missing the point with that line of thinking. And how can you develop the posture of being the kind of person who has the kind of character where your sexuality is a force for good in the world and is a way that you express this kind of nature of other oriented love. So yeah, I mean, no, there's no chart there of what you can and can't do, but I guess for me, like I would kind of encourage, if you're in churches or communities that are inclusive, I think there is a conversation to have about an inspiring, like you said, like, man, if we can at least get people to actually understand consent in a in a way that is
yeah.
genuine, that would be a good baseline. But like let's push for the kind of relationships that are something that we can aspire towards and inspire each other towards. We are coming up on an hour, and it's pretty late at night. I just want to thank you, Carl, for having this conversation. But also, there's so many tricky parts of this to navigate, right? Like this conversation has these flow-on effects in terms of how people engage with politics, how they engage with church spaces, how they use language, and obviously there's so much there that we can't cover in this time. But as some of this might be kind of popping up in people's news feeds, or maybe as people are maybe through this conversation kind of just becoming aware of some of this, again, what would be some pastoral wisdom that you would encourage us in terms of how we might have these conversations well, which is can be very difficult, but any thoughts on how people might continue the conversation from here in a way that is constructive?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing these conversations in a lot of different contexts for a long time now, and I think to me, like the ability to remember the humanity of the other side, and I want to add to that the trauma that the other side is going through, because I felt in this conversation online that both sides were speaking from a place of their own trauma, which is really important that people can articulate that and stand up for themselves. And I didn't see an acknowledgement that there was trauma on the other side, that people who are hoping to be normal and hoping to just come across as a nice Christian person and maybe be able to explain themselves to their pastor properly, probably have a sense of abandonment out of the way that the church has treated LGBT people, in the same way that other people, they want to kind of throw that all off and say, you can't tell me what to do, and storm out of the building. And that is also a valid reaction to oppression. But I think that in conversations, when I can't see the humanity or see the pain in the other side, that's when I need a break. Like that's when I need to, because I can't push that down. I can't throw that away. And when I mean, sometimes I've seen something come up in the news about queer issues and somebody makes a statement and I'm just livid and I'm just furious. And it's not a time that I can ignore my feelings. It's also not a time that I can articulate what I believe really well. And I think, if sometimes if an author says something that doesn't resonate with you, don't read them for a while. Like, I think that could be a really healthy response. And I'm not saying that that means you don't have a place in this conversation, because the conversation is happening. There's queer theology conversations happening. There are different spaces. I have friends who go to the queer theology conferences. I have those who go to the Side A, Side Revoice conference, and they're finding spaces in which they're safe to have the part of the conversation that they need. Most of the time, your opponent in a conversation like this is just trying to do the work of following God the best they can, and they're trying to find a way to do that has integrity in a way that is kind. And when we're treading on each other's toes, I think that most of the time, that's happening out of ignorance, and also because we're a bit kind of frozen in our reaction to a terrible situation, and looking for the way that the Spirit is working in somebody else's life can be a really, really difficult, slow process. But I think it's worth it to keep looking if you don't see that just yet.
Well put. Well, Karl, it's always great to have you on the pod. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming on again, and I'm sure you'll be back in due course.
Yeah, I would love to come back anytime you want, for sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you to everyone who's been with us for this conversation. Be kind, take care of yourself, and do your best to engage in that slow work of seeing the human in front of you, and maybe that the Spirit, God, love is working, even if it's maybe difficult to see at times. All right. Catch you next time.
Thanks, man.